Thanks all for joining. We'll be starting in just a couple minutes.
Okay, hello everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here on a Saturday. We are excited for this panel discussion. I think this is where we can really get into some of these important conversations that we really designed this conference to address. So thank you again to both our panelists and our audience for making the time to be here for this important discussion. As a brief introduction, my name is Shivani. I'm a first-year medical student at UCLA, and I'm the chair of the speaker committee for LAGHC, and I'm honored to be here. And my co-moderator is Nafisa, if she would like to introduce herself.
Sure. Thanks, Shivani. My name is Nafisa Wara. I am also a first-year medical student at the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA, and I'm one of the co-directors for this conference this year. Thanks so much for joining us.
Wonderful. So to give a brief overview of the structure of this panel, we will have three about 6 to 7 minute sort of mini talks, mini presentations from each of our fabulous panelists today, where they'll tell us a little bit about their work, their background, and their perspective on this broad topic of capacity building. And then we'll have about 20 minutes for a moderated Q&A between our panelists on some important questions that have been raised. And then we'll have about 10 minutes for Q&A from the audience. And so audience members, as we're going throughout this session, feel free to keep thinking of questions you'd like to ask either all of the panelists or directed at a specific panelist. And if you have a question, you can direct them specifically to Nafisa in the chat. So if you can, just for the sake of keeping track of questions, if you can go ahead and targeted send those to Nafisa, that would be much appreciated. So with that, I would like to go ahead and get started with introducing our amazing panel here. Nafisa, you want to kick us off?
Sounds good. Thank you so much. So the first person that I'll be introducing is Dr. Jessica Haberer, who is the Director of Global Health Research at Massachusetts General Hospital. Dr. Haberer is an internist at MGH and an associate professor at Harvard Medical School. She has been working in global health and studying adherence to antiretroviral medications for the treatment and prevention of HIV infection since the early 2000s. Her research focuses on real-time adherence monitoring and intervention, and her current projects are based in Uganda, Kenya, and South Africa. I'd love to just welcome her and turn this over to Dr. Haberer for her presentation.
Great, thanks so much. I will go ahead and share my screen. Okay, can you see that? Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you all today. As Nafisa and Heather know, I'm sitting here in my office in the midst of a blizzard. So I can imagine and just sort of wish I was in sunny Los Angeles. But anyway, I'm glad to be here either way, and happy to share some of my perspective being a researcher in the global north and thinking about how we can be effective with capacity building. These are my funding sources. I don't think they're a conflict, but just want to be transparent. And I'll start by talking a little bit about why research can be so complex and challenging, and why thinking about capacity building is such a key issue. And some of this is pretty straightforward and logical. To be an effective researcher, you have to, as an individual, have a lot of curiosity. You have to have that drive, that energy and enthusiasm to get up in the morning and do the research and work through this process. You have to have years and years of education in order to do this. So being a researcher is difficult. When thinking about mentors, it's hard to find good mentors. So you need to have someone who's willing and able to provide sustained, high quality commitment to any person who desires to become a researcher in their career. So finding the right mentor for an individual is really also challenging. And then you have to have an institution, and especially if you're doing lab-based research, you have to have an institution that's able to support the kind of work that you want to do. That requires, the equipment, the resources, the reagents, and, anything that may be necessary for the type of research you want to do. And then you have to have the infrastructure within the institution to process all of the grants that you are able to get, the people who can help you with your projects, and of course you need funding. So the way I think about research and capacity building is really like a team sport. Nobody just does research. This is really something that requires so many people working together. And regardless of where you're working, it just requires a ton of capacity. And then in thinking about, how to do this well, I think we have to kind of step back a little bit and understand the situation. And you may have been talking about this already in some of your other presentations and discussions, but thinking about how global health works, and how much the global north tends to drive global health in general. And I'm going to be a little bit pessimistic here, but I am actually a very optimistic pessimist. And so we'll talk about how I think about all these things, but I think it's very important to take an honest look at the way global health works. And I am speaking purely about research here, although I think it applies to a lot of programs and other things as well. So why is this the case? Again, some of this is fairly obvious and logical, but it's, again, good to think through. So in terms of economic resources, most funding comes from the global north, and because the funding comes from here, a lot of the priorities that people who are coming from this setting are the questions that get answered, and the questions that get asked, and the questions that get answered through global health. And there's a partnership there where people are working together. But that initial question, and really what's driving a lot of the relationships, is coming from a northern led priority. And our partners in the South are often not trained, empowered, or even eligible to get this funding. So that economic imbalance, I think, underlies a lot of the challenges that we face. There are also a lot of academic resources that are imbalanced between the global north and the global south. So having longitudinal supported career development mechanisms, those are absolutely critical. You know, going back to the many steps I outlined in just a slide ago, you really have to have a longitudinal system in order to become a successful researcher. I know myself, I spent many years going to college and training for medicine and got a master's degree, and then I got a K award, so 5 years of mentored support. So I didn't get here without a lot of capacity and a lot of input, and that's really something that I think is less developed in a lot of our partner sites. There's not really much of this concept of protected time. So having time that you're not seeing patients, having time that you're not teaching classes to become a researcher. I spend 80% of my time, even though I'm still clinically active, I spend 80% of my time staying up on the literature, writing grants, writing papers. All of that is really critical to become an effective researcher and to really lead in my field. And if you don't have that time, if you're constantly seeing patients or teaching, it's really hard to have that equal footing with your partners in the North. The opportunity for advancement, including mentorship, is often underdeveloped in a lot of our partner institutions. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second and what we can do about it. And that infrastructure that I mentioned, someone to process the grants, someone to help with the IRB, all those nuts and bolts are often quite limited or just getting started in many institutions in the Global South. So my colleague Jaap Boom, who I hope will be able to join us, I think he's having trouble getting on, but I've worked with Jaap for many years. He's a microbiologist from Cameroon, and again, hopefully he'll be speaking with us in person in a few minutes. But he and I sat down and tried to think about this and in a more, not so that pessimistic approach that I was kind of alluding to earlier, but what can we actually do about it? And thinking about some concrete steps that would help us in advancing more equitable relationships. Because I enjoy working with Jaap and many of my other colleagues around the world, but I think we can do this a lot better than what we do now. So we came up with 5 areas to focus on, and this is by no means exclusive, but I think it does give us a nice structure to think about how we can be more equitable in our partnerships. We can start by having really good communication about goals and expectations, who's doing what, why, how. That again sounds very simple. A lot of this is deceptively simple because good communication is challenging. But having those conversations is really important. And sometimes formalizing that, having it written down, not necessarily a contract, but just to make sure that that understanding is really present for all the work that we do together. I keep talking about mentorship because that's absolutely critical. And many of my mentees are based elsewhere. Some are here in Boston, but I would say about half are in Kenya, Uganda, or South Africa. And I think, having those kind of models that have been very successful for me and my colleagues here more available to our partners is really critical. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second as well. Redefining academic currency and priorities. So a lot of what drives us in research is based on grants and papers. But if that really pushes us to focus on our own questions and our own success, that's not helping this really central mission in global health. So can we prioritize how much mentorship we provide to our partners? Can we find other things besides having that first authorship that can help us advance our careers and be more impactful? Those things are really important in the global north and also in the global south to make sure that this type of work is valued and prioritized as well in their own academic pathways. Obviously, investment is important, and this can be done in a lot of ways. Like I've mentioned, I had a K award through the NIH that gave me 5 years of support, that protected time. Those kinds of grants are relatively rare in a lot of places around the world, but they don't have to be. And there are a number of models, including some through the NIH, some through Wellcome Trust, and others that can create that same pathway that I grew up in for others around the world. And then finally, to think about partner-based development. And I do hope Jaap can join us because he's very, very much invested in this and thinking about how to mobilize resources for African investment in African-based research, which I think is going to be absolutely critical going forward. In thinking about what we can do more practically, Jaap and I and several others, both here at Harvard in the Center for African Studies, but also with the African Academy of Sciences, gathered about 25 or so participants from nearly as many universities and institutions across Africa, including South Africa, Kenya, Uganda. You can see them all on the slide there. To brainstorm about this. And this was something that we'd hoped to do in person. Of course, we were planning to do this in early 2020, which was bad timing. But we've had a few conversations over the last couple of years and are starting to make some progress in crystallizing what exactly those principles can look like and to move forward together. So we've come up with 3 different categories, again, of practical things that we can do to meet these goals. So we started off with low-hanging fruit, thinking about what can we do today? What can we do without having to get additional funding, which is always a barrier. So we talked about different models of mentorship, like I was mentioning before, including peer networks, sharing a lot of what has been successful in certain pockets, but hasn't really spread for lack of really mechanisms to do so. How can we share best practices with our funders so they understand what we are trying to do, even if it doesn't move into the funding yet? And then asking for leadership at all of the institutions, Global North and Global South, to really demonstrate that this is important, that career development is a priority. And then we talked about initiatives that would potentially require additional funding. So thinking about restructuring the ecosystem at each institution to create that protected time or to increase availability of resources, and particularly for women who I think struggle with the balance between work and home life. But to make other resources more available, shifting the pieces a bit, but ideally investing in them as well, and thinking about more exchanges that could happen both remotely and in person. And then finally, thinking about higher level initiatives. So what could we do as a collective, thinking about groups, regional bodies like the African Academy of Sciences that has a bit more heft in talking to funders like the NIH or Wellcome Trust or others about really including a lot of these ideas in the grants that they provide. Instead of providing 8% for indirect costs, which is tiny, let's make it a little bit more on par with what kind of indirect costs go to Western funders or Western institutions like my own institution, which takes about 74% indirects. It's a big difference of what you can do between 74 and 8%. We can also think about different ways of investment. And I think South Africa is really a leader here, really creating some interesting models about how to fund career development and capacity building. And then again, thinking more about what can the South do with the South in pursuing these goals. So I think I've probably spoken too long, but I'll just conclude my introductory remarks by saying that global health is an amazing field, and I'm very happy to be in it. I am a bit pessimistic sometimes about the way global health happens, but I am very optimistic about what we can do as a field when we think about all of these issues. And as a kind of core principle, I like to remind myself that global health is fundamentally local health somewhere. And in order to value that and really engage on an equitable level, we really do need to prioritize that equity in our partnerships very intentionally. So I think we have a key role to play in supporting the Global South and meaningful capacity building so that we can jointly pursue impactful research that benefits us all. So I will stop there and turn it back to Nafisa and I think Heather.
Thank you so much, Dr. Haber. That was amazing. You hit on so many of the questions that we are hoping to address in this session. So thank you so much. Before continuing, like you mentioned, I just wanted to pause for a second and say that we are hoping that our third panelist, Professor Jaap Baum, will be able to join us later today in this session. He is calling in or zooming in from Cameroon, and so might be having some technical difficulties there right now. But we just wanted to sort of explicitly say that we really value his contribution and connection and his perspective to all of this work. So we're hoping that he'll be able to join later today, and if not, we will try to make sure that we can have his perspective and thoughts shared at another event after this as well. So with that, I would like to then introduce our final panelist, Dr. Heather Wipfli. Dr. Wipfli is an associate professor at the Department of Population Science and Public Health at the USC Keck School of Medicine and is a director of the USC Global Research Implementation and Training Lab. She has over 20 years of experience in global health research and capacity building, including serving as a principal investigator on several NIH-funded international research and capacity building grants. Dr. Wipfli received her doctorate from the Graduate Institute of International Studies and Development at the University of Geneva, and where she was awarded for her work on global capacity, global tobacco control policy. And before joining USC, she worked as a technical officer within the Tobacco Free Initiative at the World Health Organization and as project director for the Institute for Global Tobacco Control at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. So with that, Dr. Wipfli, thank you so much for being here with us, and take it away.
All right. Let me see really quick. Let me get my slides up and my voice heard. Everything good? All right, let me go ahead. So I was really impressed during the introduction today to the conference. The host today mentioned right off the bat this issue of decolonization and the real interest amongst the field and specifically students over the last few years in how we can decolonize global health. And so based on this interest and the interest from my students, I wanted to kind of pick up on that theme for our talk today. And many of my students, which are in the audience, so hello, here I am talking about all the topics we talk about every day. But specifically, I wanted to point out that in my title today, I talk about advancing anti-colonial capacity building in global health. And that's really a call out to the work that's been done, around anti-racism. And I think a lot of the momentum that's been driving this decolonization discussion in global health has been driven by the Black Lives Matter movement and other racial discussions that are happening in both the United States and around the world. And I wanted to pick up on that theme and think about how, as global health students and researchers and practitioners, we can't just not be colonial in ourselves and on our actions. We have to go, just like we can't just be not racist, we need to go beyond that. We need to be anti-colonial. We need to really be aggressive in deconstructing systems and structures that perpetuate colonial attitudes and practice and global health. That's what I want to talk a little bit about today. So I'm going to be a slight revolutionary in my talk today. So starting out with just colonizing global health practice and what does that mean and what does that look like? I have a link down at the bottom of my slide, which is to a recorded talk by Randall Packard, who's a historian of global health. And I think it's a wonderful presentation because specifically it outlines really clear historical facts, events, and practices that got us to the global health environment that we have today. But in conclusion, based on his talk and kind of a lot of talks out there that you can go and watch, the literature really focuses on these kind of 5 elements of what it means to have colonial global health practice. The first is that it's top down. It's driven by, as Jessica was saying, the North and kind of these elite institutions or elite funders that tell those kind of dictate what programs and research is going to be done. And an emphasis on upward accountability, that again, it's these institutions, it's these funders, it's these government institutions that are in the end responsible for improved public health. It's a faith in biotechnology and technological solutions, while at the same time lacking attention to social determinants of health. And overall, it's a discounting of local knowledge and the prioritization of external expertise. So what does that look like in terms of capacity building efforts? And, I've been part of numerous capacity building efforts over the past couple decades, those funded by, NIH, the Fogarty programs, I want to acknowledge my own participation in these programs and kind of my own experience. And this is kind of me making these, highlighting these aspects of these programs that have been repetitive over time. So really there's a focus on prominent universities and large donors. No disrespect to Jessica, but for example, Harvard's been very heavily represented today in the conference. And so there is a level of respect and as is appropriate, but just a level of influence that comes from these very prominent universities that are very present in global health and often dictate what is knowledge and what is important, as well as the large donors, as Jessica mentioned, that have all the money that can kind of dictate priorities. Unidirectional learning programs. And so, a lot of times what historically this is included is kind of taking promising young researchers from low and middle income countries, relocating them to high income institutions where they receive training and degrees. Oftentimes this resulted in brain drain because they ended up not leaving for one reason or another, or not relocating back to their home country. But this idea that, the expertise is held in one source site and we either bring people or we deliver that expertise unidirectionally. There's also a reliance on prescribed best practices and technical know-how. So again, this whether it's a technological or a specific approach that is prioritized over others. And then assessment is based on skill acquisition for academic or funding success. And again, Jessica's her presentation was fabulous and kind of outlining what the requirements are for academic success and research success in our current environment. And so a lot of times that might even look, those who are most successful are those that can write in English really well, right? Who can write an English academic essay in English, where, is that really what we need to improve health outcomes on the ground in communities worldwide and to promote equity. So thinking about how we can advance anti-colonial global health capacity building. And again, this is just me brainstorming in the lead up to today over the last couple of days. But one is to democratize knowledge generation. So it was mentioned that research is complex and challenging. And within the context of our current research infrastructure in global health, that's absolutely true. And it does take years and years of training to be able to produce peer-reviewed articles that get published in the Lancet. But there's actually nothing complicated about data collection. We can, basic educated individuals at all levels of society can collect data. They can interpret their data and they can share their data with their community members and with leaders and advocate for change. So this idea that, somehow research is so sophisticated that it needs to be reserved for those with extreme qualifications is something that I think we need to challenge. And we need to make sure that everyone realizes that actually research is simply the repeated collection of information in a systematic way. And anyone is capable of doing that, whether through observation or survey or other methods. We also need to invest and give money to the people and communities who are impacted. So instead of just reinvesting again and again in our elite institutions and our elite individuals who have reputations for expertise, we need to come back and give money to promising individuals who have the capacity to bring change to their community. Part of that talk by Randall Packard talks about how that again and again, we find that individuals who are identified as change makers and promising new leaders from low-income countries over time fail to generate the investment from donors as their white or high income colleagues do. And so there's this a continual persistent undermining and lack of investment in communities and of color or lower income communities, even though they have the expertise and capacity to carry out the work. I'm going to push that we avoid nomenclature that implies weakness and lack of power. And this is something that's really persistent in our field right now. How many of you have heard vulnerable populations in the past week? We use that language all the time. We talk about marginalized people. Just that wording in and of itself implies that these populations are somehow less or weaker than the reference population that we're talking about. And I think we need to be very careful about that, because even though our intentions for using this language might be positive, the actual impact is not. And we talk about that a lot in diversity, equity, and inclusion training that perhaps some of you have had, right? With the microaggressions and bias, implicit biases. And we have that throughout our field, and we need to really go carefully through and think about how we speak about different populations. We also have to do better at respecting local knowledge and advancing this bi-directional forms of learning, which I think students in particular are really great at. So I just wanted to share one small project that I'm involved in right now that happened after COVID. The COVID lockdown took place, and really as a model for how to shift research to the people, and in this case, young people. And it's a program called the Youth Public Health Ambassador Program that I've been helping to implement along with a number of students in my GRIT lab, that's the Global Research Implementation and Training Lab at USC, as well as community partners in Northern Uganda. So the goal of the program, what happened was we had ongoing research projects and activities taking place, and then COVID made it so that obviously our participation on the ground in the programming became much more complicated, and we had to think about how to continue on our partnerships and our collaborations in the lockdown environment. And so one thing we did was come up with this idea that we could train youth in public health concepts so that they could serve as data collectors, community educators, and advocates in their own community, working with community partners and local officials. They were able to select 30 young people aged 17 to 22 to serve as youth public health ambassadors. These youth were both in and out of school with kind of educational levels ranging from basic primary education through secondary education. We were able to train them. And so thinking about how this happened, we had students based in Uganda at Makerere University. We had students from Gulu University. We had local community health organizers, and we also had students and faculty here in Los Angeles over Zoom multiple times per week, talking about how to put together these various resources and train the students. And then we gave them the resources to be able to go out into their communities and deliver public health educational programming, and then supported them in carrying out a community-based participatory research study where they did a community health assessment. So I want to get to our discussion. So I'm just going to show a couple pictures of what this looked like over the last couple months during the COVID breakdown or lockdown. As you see, here are students, here are our ambassadors in a training session, and you can see the screen. There is a Zoomed participants coming in for like 1 hour of their 3-day workshop just to say hello and to share experiences and discuss kind of shared experiences with COVID. There's a picture of the students learning how to make reusable pads and then taking those kits out into their community. There's an image of them delivering malaria education then in their community following their initial training. There's a picture of the youth doing survey collection, data collection in their communities, and then also kind of an image of these students after they've done so, putting it into Qualtrics and using an online data system to generate their data. And now we're in the process of analyzing it with them and putting together upcoming events, like they can speak on the radio and on television, presenting to local leaders, presenting to their national leaders. And, you know, and in no place is, you know, this is them doing their own presentations, doing their own work, speaking on their own behalf, and using, you know, what we would traditionally think of as very sophisticated methods to do that. So just kind of thinking about how we can all participate and engage in that type of work. And so just note that this is not my NIH funded capacity building. This is kind of my self-funded and student-based project. But I'm thinking that we can show how this can be done so that hopefully these practices can be borrowed and adapted upward as all of you students grow to take on the powers that be and change the way that we function. Thanks.
That was amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Whipley. And it was so wonderful to hear about a very tangible, concrete project that especially was able to happen during COVID, given all of those limitations. So that's really incredible. I would like to sort of transition us to a bit of our discussion. And our first question for both of you is about what has been the biggest challenge or hurdle to capacity building, however you want to define that, in your work or career thus far.
Do you want us to just take turns answering? And first, I'll just kind of acknowledge that I feel a bit awkward doing this without a representative, from our partnerships here. And I think it's really emblematic, because we were talking about this a little bit before the session started, emblematic of some of these challenges, that we're here having this discussion because we have the resources to have really good internet connections. And, I don't know exactly why YAP isn't able to join today, but this isn't the first time. In that Pathways initiative I talked about before, he and I were co-leading it. And his internet connection kept dropping out. And it was just like, that was a huge challenge, to answer your question, like what has been the biggest challenge? I don't know if it was the biggest, but it's something that we see over and over again, like the playing field is not level. And to be able to really lead, in the research you're doing, and lead in, this kind of meta level of thinking about how can we do this better, you really have to have those tools. And they're just not equitably distributed. So I think part of the challenge is just that, like we need to make more resources more equitably available. I think one of the more common, again, I'm not sure if it's the biggest, I think that's kind of hard to pin down, but I can just tell you a few other things that I find really challenging, is that academic currency that I mentioned. I think it's really, I'm in a privileged position. Like I'm a full professor. Like the last thing I need is another paper, like that's not where I am in my career. So I can give first authorship away. It's not an issue, but for those of you who are young students and you're getting started and you want to do this kind of work, you do need to establish yourself as a researcher, and you need first author publications. That's just how the field works. We can try to challenge that. I love what Heather said about democratizing research and thinking about other ways to do this. But in our current system, people need to lead projects, to become experts, to gain that knowledge, to have that experience, to become known for X, Y, or Z, whatever area you're working in. And that's hard, when people are vying for the same thing. And so there are lots of things we can do about that. It doesn't have to be that way. It's not like whenever I start a project with one of my partners, it's not a zero-sum game. Like it's not that every project can only have one paper. How can we develop projects together where I as a West researcher can answer some questions that are interesting to me and part of the project, and again guided by local priorities, but that would be my takeaway. And then my partners have their takeaway. Everybody can gain from a project. It can be really done well together, but that depends on that initial communication I talked about, of having these kind of discussions early, having them be part of the development of the project. But it all kind of comes back to that initial challenge of how do you grow professionally, making sure that you're not hogging the limelight. And I think, again, we can kind of challenge that by saying, what should the structure be, and work on that. But also, even within this imperfect structure, we can think about ways that we're not competing with each other, but really just kind of bringing each other up in an intentional way from the very beginning of any project.
Yeah, I would kind of hop on that. I was thinking initially, just as Jessica was saying, the biggest probably challenge over the past 2 decades has been communication, and just the difficulties and the time it takes to communicate. Over the last just few years, that has been revolutionized. Our ability to communicate and our ability to speak face to face has, Zoom has changed the world. And so you maybe saw on that picture that I showed you, this was a tent in northern Uganda, zooming in, colleagues from around the world to students. So I think that increasingly we need to recognize that those communication barriers to some degree are being changed, and we need to demand and require that we have that face-to-face ongoing communication with our partners all the time. There's no reason. My students are on the Zoom with their community-based partners in Uganda every single week, at least once, many of them multiple times in the week. And so that's something that's definitely changed during just my short career span. And it's something that I think that will continue to change. I also have to just reiterate again, what Jessica was saying, to do global health ethically and decolonize as we would say, puts you at a disadvantage for career advancement. There's no question about it. Whether that's because you are giving up your first author papers to your local partner, which is appropriate, and but best practice, that needs to be acknowledged. That needs to be acknowledged by our colleagues who and via appointments committees. We need to be recognized for the time that it takes to form the type of partnerships and the sustainability of those partnerships over time. You don't build capacity, you don't build relationships in just a few weeks, a few months, or even a couple of years. It takes a lot of time. I know before you all jumped on, Jessica was telling me, she's worked with YAP for many, many, many years, and they're very close colleagues. And that is a testament to her best practice. And there's a tendency, because of the way global health is funded, there's always kind of a shiny new toy or a shiny new grant to go after, and there's pressure to refocus your efforts or to find new partners or to do a new topic. And to remain steadfast in your commitment to your partners means you can't be everywhere all the time, and it means you have to be kind of in business. We call it the hedgehog philosophy, right? You kind of have to roll up and just stay committed to your topic. And that can be really difficult when there's a pressure to bring in more funding in different areas and to kind of raise your profile as high as you can for your own professional success. It's really about putting others first, and how do we get recognized for doing that?
Those are a lot of really salient and powerful points that you just brought up. So thank you so much for connecting a lot of these dots that we're discussing today. I wanted to remind the audience before I ask my next question that you can message Nafisa for any questions you have for our panelists today. And since we're a small enough group, when we get to that section, you can also unmute if you feel comfortable asking your question yourself as well. But just a reminder to submit any questions. So my next question for both of you is about the current state of the world, and given the fact that there are limited resources, what do you think are the most pressing issues that need capacity building? i.e., how would you prioritize between training or physical infrastructure or technology? There are so many things that fall under this umbrella of capacity building. And how do you ensure sustainability of whatever it is that you are directing those efforts once you have a priority list?
I guess I'll go first this point.
Yeah,
just so we swap back.
Equity. Let's flip it around. You go first. And then go.
Okay. Yeah, that's a really good question. What goes first and what should we be investing in when there's limited resources available? I guess I always come back to people. I think human resources are kind of key. And so again, having the people on the ground who can advocate for themselves and who can identify their own needs and who can then, insist on the investments, that's the most crucial thing. Any one single technological tool or infrastructure that's put in place, if it doesn't have people there to support it and to maintain it, then it won't last. And I think we've seen that happen again and again and again over time. But it's really investing in people and in the programs and in the pipeline in order to sustain whatever it is that's needed over time.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with all of that. And I think for me, I would go back to, to my partners and ask them, what do they want to prioritize, like Heather was saying. And that's really what that Pathways Initiative is all about that I mentioned. Those ideas that I highlighted very briefly are all coming from our partners. I did not generate those. Nobody in the Global North generated those. Those are all from our partners who in this initiative are all based in Sub-Saharan Africa. I think one of the challenges, even with that initiative, and we've actually had to pause it a little bit in the last couple of months because everybody was very enthusiastic and really enjoyed the conversations, and life set in. Like it's one thing to go to a meeting like this and to have all these great ideas, but to be able to sustain that investment in making change is really, really hard. And we're going to do it. We're going to keep going. We're going to make sure that we can find the time and find the right people, but that enthusiasm is hard to maintain when you've got, your family to feed and your patients to see and all these other things. And then when you fundamentally get back to the idea of creating change, that's incredibly difficult. And I think, from just my own personal perspective, I would love to see a lot of investment in institutional change, which is even harder still. And there are some amazing thinkers, in this area about how to generate institutional change, but it's a marathon for sure. It's not a sprint. And I think that challenge of sustainability is just really front and center and has to be part of how we think about going about, whether we're investing in individuals or, and how they are able to function in their institutions. If you have a project that's dependent on one person or one group of people, it's vulnerable. And so I think trying to, work in the short term as well as the long term, but that ultimate long-term goal, I think is going to have the most impact by creating structures and institutions that really enable this kind of long-term investment in people so that they can again answer the questions that are relevant to them with local resources, and then in partnership with people like me and Heather and many on this call who want to contribute to that. But it all comes back to having, I think, the institutions that enable individuals to thrive.
Absolutely. I think you both hit on key points about the larger changes that are needed, and sort of listening to what people need. We should, in terms of who's the one who's making these priorities. So absolutely. I'm going to turn it over to Nafisa, who has been receiving some questions from our audience. So she'll go ahead and continue our Q&A.
Thanks so much, Shivani, and thanks so much again, Dr. Haber and Dr. Wipfli, for being here with us. I have received a few questions from the audience so far. Definitely feel free to continue messaging me with any questions that you have. And also, after I go through the questions that we currently have, if there are any more pressing questions that you'd like to unmute and ask, definitely please feel free. So the first question that I received from the audience, I think is more directed towards Dr. Wipfli based on something that came up in your presentation, but I would also invite Dr. Haber to comment as well based on your experiences and what you have learned from your partners. But I know, Dr. Wipfli, you described reframing the terms that we use to describe folks who we're working with, that have historically been called vulnerable or marginalized. What language do you recommend that we use to reframe these terms?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm not sure I have specifically the right answer, but I think that we could use the actual terms of the population that we're speaking about. So, we can label them specifically, like in the case of this program, we're talking about the youth in the Lira district of northern Uganda, and we're talking about rural youth living in rural communities, even low-income rural communities. That is more specific. I would think that I would tie it to conversations that perhaps you've heard before regarding terminology like that we've already been attacking, like first world, second world, third world. We no longer use that terminology. And, even the developing words that we don't technically use so much anymore. And instead we turn towards low middle income country, LMIC, as being and it's still problematic in some ways, but still being a very data-driven kind of non-judgmental framing of that population. So, first, second, third versus high, middle, low income could be, very, very different in the way that the impact is felt on the community being described.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Whitfley. I think it's really valuable just to understand, the importance of specificity, I think, especially to collaborators and partners. The next question that I have received from the audience is one that I think is based on a topic that both of you described in your remarks, which is, relating to these conversations that younger trainees and investigators who may understand the necessity to maintain some sort of to maintain an anti-colonialist perspective on how to pursue global health work. They're faced with an existing structure that basically exists based on the perpetuation of components of that colonialist structure of global health. So how can newer public health workers navigate starting those conversations with their mentors or their advisors as they enter the field?
I'm happy to start, and Heather, please feel free to jump in. So it's the question about how to talk to people who are not working already in this area. And you mentioned talking to mentors. Are you making the assumption like the mentor is not focused on the importance of decolonization or working towards equity?
That's my interpretation of the question. Yes, definitely feel free to the person who chatted it to me if you would like to clarify further, but that was my read of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the conversation is probably going to be somewhat similar to what we're talking about today. I often start any kind of project or any collaboration by saying, why am I here? Why am I doing this? I could be doing anything, I could be in my clinic, 5 miles from here, working, with a patient. I could be answering some questions in that clinic, or I could be working with my partner in South Africa on something there. What is my role? What do I bring to the table? And I think most collaborations, again, it's team sport, research is a team sport. We can't do this alone. And I think when you start when you come to the table with that framework of what am I bringing, then you start to realize how much each person has a role to play. And if somebody is just thinking, what's the problem out there and how am I going to fix it? Because that's what we do in America, we're very focused and that kind of perspective really doesn't incorporate a lot of these ideals of decolonization and increasing equity. But if it's more for me, maybe what I bring is how to develop the right study design. Or I do a lot with mHealth and kind of understanding the balance between, or the integration of tech and health and social behaviors, that sort of thing. But my partner is going to bring their expertise perhaps in having treated patients in that setting with these, with whatever we're working on. And so I think understanding really what is the goal here, why is each person there, and who else do we need to bring in? I think that perspective helps really not just push an agenda per se, but really help understand why we're doing this. What is our goal? And I think that naturally then lends itself to understanding how we can do this more equitably.
Yeah, I might just add just a couple words. One thing is that I do want to stress that in academia and in kind of the world that we live in we are all about deconstruction, right? And analysis and kind of problematizing everything that we do. And so that makes it so pretty much everything we do has weaknesses in it. And at some point as a professional, you have to decide where that line is for you on action. So do you deconstruct all the way that you say, okay, I'm no longer comfortable working in this space and I'm not going to engage? Or do you say, okay, I recognize this and there's a level of contradiction perhaps in my activity, or there's the value that I see in what I can personally bring to this field of work, and you decide to act. Right. And so I often talk about that with my students who, I've been accused of white saviorism and interventionism and lack of partnerships many, many times by students over the years. And I take it very seriously and I reflect. And I think I reflect on that issue I mentioned earlier, which is intention versus impact. I know my intentions are pure. I know I want to be decolonialist in my personal activities. But then I have to reflect back and is actually the impact of my work being counterproductive to my intention, and then try to respond to that as best I can. But in the end, I personally do believe in this teamwork and in this ability to work together, and that we are together on this planet. And I can learn so much from my colleagues in low-income environments that teach me about how better to serve my population here and there and everywhere. And so I'm open, I'm learning, I'm partnering, I'm trying as much as I can to deconstruct the problematic structures I see around me. But at the same time, I accept a level of contradiction in what I'm doing and am open to some ridicule because of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate just all of the self-reflection and the understanding of positionality and responding to that question. I think this question from the audience is similar. It's quite related. I think it's a little bit more specific to some of the points in moving along in a professional career in global health, but really thinking about authorship in the context of research work, especially. This participant is curious about whether what authorship looks like, for a young investigator, someone, a trainee, and, whether someone is able to really, give up first authorship when building their career, or whether that's something that really is only a more accessible option once you have established a career, and how do you kind of navigate that process?
Jessica, you talked more about that.
I was gonna say, I feel like I kind of brought that up a bit more. I don't really feel like you're giving anything up. If you go into this work with the perspective that I was describing before, where you have that open communication and you again talk about what each person is bringing and what do they want to walk away from, from that relationship or that project with. So it's not really someone's to give up. If we really are prizing equity in the relationship, it is part of everything that you're doing together. When I design a project with my colleagues, or one of my colleagues asks me to join their project, and I think that really is the goal. Like, it's not just, again, me coming in from Harvard, and I recognize what that means, to be coming from Harvard, with our pillars and all that sort of stuff. If people are inviting me to work with them, I think that's a good check right there, to know that the relationship is at least, starting on a good level. Like, there's a reason for me to be there. The authorship issue, as I said, this is not a zero-sum game. We don't have to say, this project is going to produce this paper. We can very intentionally from the beginning say, Nafisa, what is your role in this project, and what do you want to, which piece do you want to lead? And that may be, a part of the trial. It may be maybe you want to add on some qualitative work, or you want to answer a slightly tangential question that you can weave in. Great. And I can ask Heather what she wants to do, and we can continue to do that. So, that currency, again, it's not the ideal. It's what we're dealing with for the, short term at least. And as we work on changing those structures, we can live within that system by figuring out a way that we can, again, help each other and the whole collaborative rise up so that everybody can get what they need out of a project and not have to think about it as something that I'm giving away or that somebody needs to give away. If it's something that we, intentionally from the beginning, make sure that everybody is getting what they need and want from the collaboration.
Yeah, I think part of this also comes from where global health has been positioned within academic institutions. For example, at a medical school that's a traditional medical school that has an A&P committee, right? The appointment and promotion committee that has a very traditional frameworks, and they have just like, your boxes that they're completing and how many first author papers are there, and it's a number, and it's like you either made the threshold or you didn't. And we have to do a really good job as global health academics and in re-educating our A&P committees and putting together different criteria for promotion that is going to recognize what means best practice in our field. And it's really difficult. And so we maybe have a little bit more flexibility in schools of public health to be able to convince A&P committees about those different qualifications and criteria. But we're a growing new discipline, and getting tenure within global health has been exceptionally difficult for professionals for academics throughout the country. I can definitely talk at length about that. But we're slowly improving, and I think part of it is re-educating our A&P committees about what it means to, what does a good CV for a global health academic look like. And maybe it's a lot of second author or third author papers with really clear first authors from our partnership, communities being highlighted, and that gets us points. I know one other thing that I did when I was early on in my career is I did a lot of multi-country research. And it was very clear at the beginning that, any research that was produced at the country level and any papers that were written at the country level were first authored and owned by the country investigators. And then I, as the international kind of collaborator, took the lead on the multi-country analysis. And that was like the one paper that I had first authorship of. And so, just kind of thinking again about these creative ways in which everyone gets something beneficial out of the partnership, and that is all contributing to everyone's career.
Thank you both so much. I think that was just a really thoughtful response from both of you about, I think both from a trainee's perspective, how to approach those collaborations themselves and how to be really intentional about one's role in a research project, and how to, I think, initiate those conversations if they're not occurring in a research setting. And then I also think from a senior investigator's perspective, how to change the existing landscape of professional development within this field. Thank you so much for all of your answers to all of these questions. And thank you so much to the audience for these questions. I know there are a couple more questions that we unfortunately couldn't get to today just because of time, but it was just a really, really valuable discussion, and I think a really reflective discussion that can really impact how we move forward in this field. So I'm really grateful to both of you for this conversation, and to the audience. I'll turn it over to Shivani for some more closing remarks and for next steps.
Wonderful. Thanks, Nafisa. Just echoing everything that she said about how amazing this conversation has been. I think we've been able to cover a lot of ground in a short amount of time, both in terms of conceptual frameworks with which to approach this work, but then also some very tangible tools and strategies on how to move forward, and sort of some great examples that have been highlighted. So thank you for allowing us to have this conversation and really dive into these sort of complicated, nuanced topics. I know I have certainly learned a lot, so appreciate all of that and the work that you're doing, and hope to see more of that in the future coming of global health professionals as well. So I'll give a few closing reminders to our audience, which is that we will be continuing our conference shortly with our closing keynote speaker, Cynthia Gonzalez, who is an incredible activist and researcher, both started off globally and then transitioned into her local community in Los Angeles. So I would highly, highly encourage you to in the next few minutes, maybe grab that extra glass of water or coffee, whatever else you need to power through, and then head back over to our conference page. It will be the same live Vimeo setup, live streaming on our website, like you saw if you were joined us for the morning keynote, and that will be starting shortly at around 10:40 or so. So with that, we'll close this panel. Thank you so much again to our panelists and audience, and we hope to see you at our closing keynote.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. Take care.
Thank you. It was fun. Nice meeting you, Jessica.
Thank you.
And likewise.